All right, welcome back for part 2 of chapter 11. Remember, we are talking about punishment and sentencing. So we left off right here at mandatory sentences. So another effort to limit judicial discretion and at the same time to get tough on crime has been the development of mandatory sentences. Now, some states have passed legislation prohibiting people convicted of certain offenses such as violent crimes or drug trafficking from being placed on probation. They must serve at least some time in prison. And other statutes are aimed at chronic recidivists, those that kind of go in and out of prison, right? Mandatory sentencing legislation may impose minimum and maximum terms, but usually it requires a fixed prison sentence for certain crimes, if you will. And, mandatory sentencing generally limits the judge's discretionary power as well to impose any disposition, but that one that is authorized by law or by legislature. So as a result, it does limit individualized sentencing and restricts sentencing disparity. Now, more than 35 states have already replaced discretionary sentencing with, this fixed term mandatory sentences for such crimes as the sale of hard drugs, kidnapping, gun possession, and arson. And the results has been a little bit mixed. Mandatory sentences have contributed to the recent increase in the size of the correctional population to record levels. And because of mandatory sentences, many offenders who in the past might have received probation are being incarcerated. So, there's some pluses and minuses, right, to mandatory sentences. It kind of depends on, which part you look at. Now, again, mandatory sentencing is a statutory requirement, okay, that a certain penalty shall be set and carried out in all cases upon conviction for that specific offense. And like I said, some states have prohibited people convicted of certain crimes like violent felonies from being placed on probation. And you can see it's kind of a double-edged sword. If somebody commits a serious felony, should they get probation? And that's kind of, there's some debate on that. Well, what kind of came out of a little bit of this would be something called the three strikes laws. And these are long prison sentences for any person convicted of basically 3 felony offenses, even if the third crime is relatively trivial, right? And, one of the issues with this 3 strikes thing is that the law is applied differently in different state jurisdictions. Some require all 3 felony convictions to be for violent crimes in order to be, a mandatory sentence to be pronounced, whereas others provide enhanced sentencing for any third felony conviction as long as the first 2 felonies were deemed to be either violent or serious or both. So, it's kind of again, that double-edged sword, right? And although welcomed by, conservatives seeking a remedy for, violent crime, the 3 strikes policy is controversial because a person convicted of a minor felony can receive a life sentence. And, in 2 well-known California cases, defendants received life sentences for, the first one was actually stealing a pizza, and the second one stealing some chocolate chip cookies from a store. So, think about these. These 3 strike laws have, undeniable political appeal to legislators, basically being pressured by their constituents to do something about crime. But even such, these laws are, are they effective? So here, when you talk about the three strikes law, the legislature and voters passed the three strikes law, after several high-profile murders committed by ex-felons raised concern that violent offenders were being released from prison only to commit new serious violent crimes, right? And this is California we're talking about. Now, and that's another issue that you have to deal with. Are we releasing people too early and they're going out and committing more crime? Now, voters amended this law in 2012 to require that the three strikes sentencing rules only be applied when that third offense is a serious or violent felony. And Prop 36 also allowed existing, third strike inmates to petition the court for a reduction of their terms if they would have been eligible for a lesser sentence under the new law. So again, you just have to kind of look at this and decide whether you think it works or not. So here is kind of a chart, if you will, that shows from 2005 through 2015. And it shows the number of third strike inmates in California prisons. And you can see it goes up. And then here you have the passage of Prop 36. And now you start to see the three strikers go down. So the question is that good or is that not good? And here I just have some information that shows you this was the election results talking about the three strikes laws where it was first passed, right? And then in 2012, this was to kind of basically reformat, if you will, the ballot measure, and it passed again to restructure it to where that third strike had to be a serious felony. And then you have Prop 47 here. So just, some interesting voter legislation for us to keep an eye on, right? Now, along with, mandatory sentences, there's something called truth in sentencing. And as you may recall, even though criminal sentences are getting shorter, people are spending more of their sentences behind bars. And one reason is, again, kind of a get tough measure designed to fight a rising crime rate, and that's called truth in sentencing. And these laws require that an offender serve a substantial portion of their prison sentence behind bars. Basically, parole eligibility and good time credits are restricted or eliminated. So here, this is a sentencing formula or scheme, if you will. And I don't mean scheme like, like kind of a criminal type scheme, like one of those. It's a scheme meaning the format. Okay, so it's a sentencing format that requires that offenders serve at least 85% of their original sentence before they're allowed to be eligible for parole or any other form of early release. So this does require that offenders serve a substantial amount of their sentence, and it does eliminate or reduce parole opportunities and good time. So again, it kind of depends how you think, right? All right, so what are some factors that impact sentencing? So, and we're going to kind of talk about a few of those. So it could be the severity of the offense. It could be the offender's prior criminal record. It could be whether the offender used violence, whether the offender used weapons, or whether the crime was committed for money. And research actually does, in fact, show a strong correlation between these legal variables and the type and length of a sentence that's given out. Judges sentence more severely in cases involving the most serious criminal charges, things like terrorism, while they are definitely more lenient in low severity cases, right? And that it kind of makes sense. And besides these legally appropriate factors, sentencing researchers have also found to varying degrees that judges are also influenced by the defendant's age, right? Or maybe their race or gender or other kind of extra legal variables, if you will. So these are some other things that might affect sentencing. And, other things that kind of come into play also could be some of the victim characteristics, perhaps the victim's impact statement. All of these come into play, and these are factors as it relates to sentencing. And here is kind of a couple of charts that look at the type of sentence received for a felony conviction in 75 of the largest countries, if you will, with a prior conviction. Okay, so you can kind of see prison, jail, etc. So the first one, percent of violent felony convictions, percent of non-violent felony convictions. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about capital punishment. And we kind of went through all of the different things. Just to kind of go back real quick, though, I know we talked about some of these other things like social class, gender, age. Just understand that when you talk about social class, evidence supports an association between social class and sentencing outcomes. Members of the lower class may be expected to get longer prison sentences than more affluent individuals. So these are, again, things that I think that we should at least kind of understand or recognize. Another extra legal factor, we talked about age that might play a role in sentencing. It should be expected that older people might be punished more harshly than younger ones because they've had greater opportunities to accumulate a criminal record, and most state laws increase penalties for multiple offenders. And then even the victim characteristics, right, may influence sentencing. Victims may be asked or allowed to make that victim impact statement before sentencing, giving them the opportunity to tell their side of the story. Or when you're talking about, in murder cases, the surviving family can recount the effect that the crime has actually had on them. So I just wanted to expound a little bit more on those. But now back to capital punishment. So the most severe sentence used in the United States is capital punishment or execution. Okay, more than 14,500 confirmed executions have been carried out since 1608. And today there are more than 3,000 people on death row. Now, in recent years, the U.S. Supreme Court has limited the death penalty to first-degree murder, and only with what they call aggravating circumstances. Okay, so there needs to be something kind of above the norm, if you will. So, such as murder for profit, or murder for hire, or murder using extreme cruelty. These are kind of aggravating circumstances. All right. Now, in some states, or some states, have laws permitting capital punishment for such crimes as, hijacking or kidnapping for ransom, and and aggravated rape of a child. But it remains to be seen whether the courts will allow criminals, to be executed today for any crime, less serious than an aggravated first-degree murder. And the most recent death penalty data is, you can see some of it on page 448. When we talk about capital punishment, a lot of things kind of come to mind, specifically the death penalty, whether it's lethal injection, whether it's the gas chamber, whether it's hanging, whether it's the electric chair, or whether it's firing squad. So we do have some different ways that capital punishment is carried out. And then you've seen this chart before when we talk about capital punishment and we look at murder rates in those states that have the death penalty, you would think that the murder rate would be less because they have the death penalty. But typically it's kind of not. So that just kind of, it shouldn't, it should make you at least think about it. Here's a chart that shows persons executed in the United States from 1930 through 2013. And you can see how low this was down in the 70s and the 80s and how things picked up again, in the 1990s and 2000s, etc. So what then, when we talk about supporters of the death penalty, let's talk about arguments. So, supporters advance a number of arguments for keeping the death penalty. One is incapacitation, meaning supporters argue that the death penalty is the ultimate incapacitation, right? And the only one that can ensure that convicted killers can never be pardoned, paroled, or escape. And, that makes sense for those advocates that argue this. And most states that do not have capital punishment provide the sentence of life in prison without the chance of parole. However, 48 states give their chief executive the right to grant clemency and commute a life sentence that may give these lifers eligibility, and maybe even release. So these are arguments for the death penalty that, hey, they can't get away with what they've done because this is the ultimate incapacitation. Deterrence. Proponents of capital punishment argue that the execution serves as a very strong deterrent for serious crimes. Although capital punishment would probably not deter the few mentally unstable criminals, it could have an effect on the cold, calculating murderer type person, right? Such as the hired killer or someone who kills for profit. And maybe the fear of death may also convince felons not to risk using handguns during robberies. And proponents also argue that the deterrent effect of an execution can produce a substantial decline in the murder rate. And that it's morally correct. This argument contends that the death penalty is morally correct. It is mentioned in the Bible and other religious work. And again, this is those that believe in the death penalty. And although the U.S. Constitution forbids cruel and unusual punishment, this prohibition does not include the death penalty because capital punishment was widely used at the time the Constitution was drafted. So the original intent of the founding fathers was to allow the states to use the death penalty. Therefore, capital punishment may be cruel, but it's not unusual. Next would be proportional to the crime. So putting dangerous criminals to death also conforms with the requirement that the punishment must be proportional to the seriousness of the crime, right? And since we use a system of escalating punishment, it follows that the most serious punishment should be used for the most serious crime. Next, it reflects public opinion. So the death penalty is justified because it represents the will of the people. And then finally, the unlikely chance of error. Well, the many legal controls and appeals that are currently in place make it almost impossible for an innocent person to be executed or for the death penalty to be used in a racist or a capricious manner. Although some unfortunate mistakes have been made in the past, the current system makes it virtually impossible to execute an innocent person. So these are arguments for. Well, what about against? So the possibility of error. Critics of the death penalty believe that capital punishment has no place in a mature democratic society. They point to the finality of the act and to the real possibility that an innocent person could be executed. And an important congressional report cited 48 cases in which people who served time on death row were in fact released because of new evidence proving their innocence. And typically that evidence is going to be through DNA. Next would be unfair use of discretion. Critics also frown on the tremendous discretion used in seeking the death penalty and on the arbitrary manner in which it is imposed. Then next would be misplaced vengeance. So although critics acknowledge that the general public approves of the death penalty, they also maintain that prevailing attitudes reflect a primitive desire for revenge and not just desert. Public acceptance of capital punishment has, been compared to the approval of human sacrifices practiced by the Aztecs in Mexico, like 500 years ago. And at least 30 states now have a sentence of life in prison without parole, and this can more than make up for an execution. Being locked up in a hellish prison, if you will, without any chance of release, barring a rare executive reprieve, may be worse punishment than a painless death by, let's say, lethal injection. Next would be weak public support. Some politicians endorse the death penalty, in the mistaken belief that the public favors such harsh punishments for criminal offenders. But approval ratings have been in decline for the past decade. When surveys give, respondents a choice of punishments, such as life without parole, support for the death penalty tends to decline, maybe even as much as 50%. And again, well-publicized incidents of innocent people being sentenced to death have helped kind of erode the support for capital punishment. And then finally, little deterrent effect. Those opposed to the death penalty also find little merit in the argument that capital punishment deters crime. They charge that there is little hard evidence that the threat of a death sentence can convince a potential murderer to basically forego their criminal activity. And you can see here on the right, California actually, back in 2019, the governor, Newsom, signed an executive order basically putting a stop to the state's death penalty for now. So it's on hiatus. So it's still a law and they still have it, but they're not carrying out any executions. Okay, a couple more arguments. No hope of, rehabilitation. So the death sentence rules out any hope of offender rehabilitation. Race, gender, and other bias. Capital punishment may be tarnished by gender, racial, ethnic, or other biases. More people are sentenced to death, and the death penalty is used more often in nations with a large minority population. More crime than it deters. Some critics fear that the introduction of capital punishment will encourage criminals to escalate their violent behavior, consequently putting police officers at risk. So, kind of an interesting thought there. Next would be that it's brutal. Abolitionists believe that executions are unnecessarily cruel and inhumane and basically, come at a high moral and social cost. It's expensive. Some people, contend that they do not want to support some killer in prison for 30 years. But abolitionists counter that legal appeal, kind of drive the cost of executions is far higher than the costs of years, being, incarcerated. And then finally, that it's morally wrong, that the death penalty is brutal and basically not humane. Even if the general public voices approval of the death penalty, those that oppose it argue that social vengeance by death is a primitive way of revenge, which stands in the way of moral progress. All right, and then there's a lot of cases, and I'm not going to go through them all, but they're on page 458, and there are several prominent cases that have created our current understanding of capital punishment. So I will let you look at those. So we have the evolution of some cases on page 458, and then we have significant cases again on page 459. So you can kind of go through all of these. And again, I also threw up a chart that talks about 10 facts about the death penalty in the U.S. And these are from the Pew Research Center. So I thought they would be really interesting for you to look at. You can see here the majority of Americans favor the death penalty, but nearly 8 in 10 see some risk of executing the innocent person. And here, most states have the death penalty, but significantly fewer use it. So you can click on this link. It'll take you to the Pew Research Center, and I think you'll find it interesting. And then I put in a couple of other charts. So death sentences, executions have trended downward. Prisoners executed in 2019 spent an average of 22 years on death row. So a lot of information to cover. Thanks for hanging with me. And it is, of course, a very controversial subject. So with that being said, that's going to conclude part 2 of chapter 11, punishment and sentencing.